We are in the fifth and final week of our first message of the fall season. It is certainly shaped up to be a stressful season. One of the challenges being how much more difficult it has become to treat people as we would ideally like to treat them, given partisan politics and social distancing and everything else we're facing these days. It's a stressful season and a tense one too, because there's so many uncertainties. There's all kinds of uncertainty, but one thing remains certain. Jesus Christ still calls us to follow him today, as he always has. That's certain. And he calls us as a church family to support one another as we all seek to follow him. That's certain too. It's certain. It just isn't easy. It never is. But especially now with all this uncertainty, it won't be easy. In fact, the uncertainty is a challenge to our character and our core, our heart. Whether we come through all of this, whatever this turns out to be, with stronger character and greater heart, or diminished character and hurting hearts, will depend in no small measure on how we treat one another during this time, especially those who are hard to love, especially those we don't agree with. We all know we want to be loving people. And we all know that we have, room for improvement. There's a gap. And during this difficult period, that gap can grow. We tend to see people as the world sees people, defined by their political opinions, their ethnicity, their income, their education. In short, the world puts people into categories and classes and causes which actually diminish their real worth. God doesn't judge anyone's worth in any of those ways. When we learn to see people as God sees them, it's so much easier to love them as God loves them. So the goal of this series has always been to align or realign our view of people with God's view. So we began this series looking at the fact that God forgave us a debt we couldn't pay. God forgave us a debt we couldn't pay. So when others hurt us or harm us or annoy us or just get in our way, he teaches us to cancel their debt too. We love people best by forgiving them their faults and flaws and failures, just as God has already forgiven us a far greater debt. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the importance of generosity. We talked about being generous as we can, as often as we can, to as many as we can. And then we talked about really considering other people, paying attention to them, and then keeping on lookout for opportunities to serve them. Last week, we looked at how to deal with people when we're frustrated, when we feel frustrated by their behaviors or beliefs, when they're making choices that we just don't like. And instead of trying to control people or worrying about it, we can more profitably hand them over to God in prayer. And we also encouraged you last week to think about getting into a small group, especially during this season, getting into a small group. Groups are relationships that support all your other relationships, and in that sense, they can be invaluable. There are plenty of groups still open, meeting in lots of different places and ways and times, and it's easy to get involved. Check it out on our website. By the way, if you missed any or all of this series, the entire series is available online on demand, also on our website. Well, today, we're looking at a key way we can love people that we often overlook or dismiss because it seems so difficult or more difficult than it has to be. And in fact, it's not difficult at all. And to do it, we're going to look at a parable that we find in the Gospel of Matthew. Again, Jesus spoke in parables to the chief priests and elders of the people. The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests to the feast. So Matthew tells us that once again, Jesus spoke in parables. Parable is a Greek word. Actually, it's a Greek phrase referring to stories, illustrations in the form of narrative, of fictional narratives used in rhetoric to advance an argument. Jesus used this form of argument all the time. His argument, the kingdom of heaven is real. So he used stories. He used stories because people love stories. And his stories always brought unexpected twists and turns that required the listener to really think. The truth of the story, the value of the story, emerging eventually. He's using stories here in teaching the chief priests and the elders and the Pharisees because they didn't like him. They were jealous of him, and so they were closed off to the truth of his teaching. He's using stories to lure them in to that truth. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a wedding, a big one. In the Jewish culture of that time, there was no bigger party than a wedding party. They meant even more then than they do now. A wedding party wouldn't just last for a day, but extend out to several days, even an entire week. Everyone in town would come out to a wedding feast because it was a huge break, a welcome break from the tedium and drudgery that characterized daily life. There'd be food and drink and music and dancing. So a wedding would be a very big deal. But this wedding was different. This wedding was being given by a king. A king would have had the biggest, the best wedding party possible, the richest food, the choicest wine. No expense would be spared. It was an honor, it was a privilege, it was a tremendous opportunity to be invited. So everybody would come running, right? Wrong. They refused to come. They refused to come. That was absurd. The people who heard this story that Jesus was telling probably laughed out loud. Nobody would refuse to come to a king's party. A second time, he sent other servants saying, "Tell those invited, behold, I prepared my banquet. My calves are fat and fattened cattle are killed, and everything is ready. Come to the feast." Everything is ready. The food is prepared. We're ready to go. The second invitation is even more pressing and more urgent than the first, and likewise, the response is more pronounced. Some ignored the invitation and went away. One to his farm, another to his business. Previously, they refused the invitation, which was bad enough, but now they ignore it, which is extremely rude, and instead turn to routine daily duties as if no invitation had been issued and no party was being hosted. Worse still, the rest laid hold of the servants, mistreated them, and killed them. Here, the absurdity of the story turns dark. They murder the king's servant and in turn receive justice from the king. But he still wants guests for his party. So he said to his servants, "The feast is ready, but those who were invited were unworthy to come. Go out, therefore, into the main roads and invite to the feast whomever you find. The first group of guests prove themselves unworthy. How'd they do that? Why were they unworthy? Simply because they rejected the king's invitation. Worthiness before the king is completely and only determined by a willingness to accept his invitation. That's it. And since they proved themselves unworthy, the king's servants look for everyone who will accept the invitation. And don't miss this. The servants went out into the streets and gathered all they found, bad and good alike. And the hall was filled with guests. And they had their party. Now, in a parable, someone is usually God and someone is usually us, and it's usually not difficult to figure out who's who. God, in this story, is represented by the king. The wedding feast, we know, is heaven, because elsewhere, over and over again, Jesus describes heaven as a wedding feast. The guests who refuse to come to the party represent the chief priests and the religious rulers to whom he was speaking, who are rejecting his teaching and ultimately would be responsible for his death. But they also represent anyone who feels like they're disinterested in God. They're too good for God. They represent people who think they're better off without him and refuse the invitation. They represent people who are so proud they ignore the invitation. Meanwhile, the Lord calls us to identify specifically with those servants, to develop the mindset, the heart of a servant, but a very special kind of servant. Servants entrusted with wonderful good news in the form of an invitation from the Lord for those who don't know him. And while some people do reject or ignore God outright, it's true, I'm convinced that most people stay away from God and church because the invitation is misrepresented by church people and misunderstood by unchurched people. The invitation becomes all about judgment and guilt, religion and religious rule-keeping, dogma and doctrine, arcane rituals, churchy church ceremony, and all the rest. They believe that an invitation to church is about being good and holy and worthy. You can't even come to church unless you're good and holy and worthy, missing the fact that worthiness is predicated wholly and only on a willingness to accept the king's invitation. Worthiness is predicated wholly and only on a willingness to accept the king's invitation. And that invitation is to life-changing opportunity for more successful living moving forward and rewards to come. Our strategy for this has been and remains what we call invest and invite. Invest in friends, family members, co-workers, classmates, through the very things that we've been discussing in this series. Paying attention to people, serving them, adding value to their lives, and then, when appropriate, inviting them to church. Joining us online is a first step and an easy one for sure, but we'd like to suggest a new idea as a potential second step, an idea that we've kind of been talking about for a few weeks now. Invite your unchurched family, friends, co-workers, classmates to join you for a watch party. What's that? Well, it's simple. He's simply inviting friends, family members, co-workers, classmates who don't have a church to join you for church in your living room, on your front porch, at Starbucks. Maybe even spend some time after Mass discussing the message together. And that's it. That's the idea. It's a simple idea. It's a new idea. Maybe because it's a new idea, you're probably going to resist it at first, but think about it anyway instead. And if you want help with the invitation part, we have resources you can use, including electronic invitations that are quite good looking. Just check it out at churchnativity.com. Invite. Well, now, at the risk of you forgetting everything I've just said up until this point, I have an important announcement to make because I need to update you on our plans for Christmas Eve. A murmur goes through the crowd. Christmas Eve has been our biggest night of the year every year, and every year it gets bigger. Last year we had upwards of 11,000 people, probably the largest Christmas Eve Mass in the country. Who knows? You will perhaps not be surprised to learn, and it gives me no joy to share with you, that we will not be doing that this year. So neither will we be going back to the fairgrounds this year. Hopefully that is a tradition we can revive next year. We will be offering masses on Christmas Day here at church on Ridgely Road, which you can attend live in person if you choose to do so. But we've made the further decision that Christmas Eve Mass will be online only. Christmas Eve Mass will be online only. That was a difficult decision to make for sure, but we're sure it's the right one. Think about it. We can probably safely assume that in December we'll still be restricted in our seating capacity, currently at 33%. And we're certain that would not even begin to accommodate the demand for Christmas Eve Mass, potentially shutting out thousands of parishioners as well as all of our potential guests. And that just didn't feel right for Christmas Eve. So instead, we'll be broadcasting what is promising to be, what is shaping up to be a spectacular Christmas Eve Mass at 4 p.m., complete with all the beautiful music and decorations and Christmas traditions you've come to expect. Mass will also be rebroadcast throughout the evening if that time doesn't work for you. And we'll be encouraging you to start thinking now about your own Christmas Eve watch party. Think about it. Who can you invite? Maybe you already have plans to be with family or friends, and some of them are unchurched, and you can begin your evening with Mass. Or maybe you know a neighbor who would otherwise be alone. Or maybe you just gathered your household members to celebrate all in one place. Together, we could create the ultimate watch party with thousands and thousands worshiping all at the same time, all around our community and across the country and far, far beyond. And if you think about it in that way, this Christmas Eve could be our biggest yet.